Seraphina, forgive me. Edmund has married Vivienne.
Seraphina, the truth is out. I cannot hide it any longer.
How could you betray me like this?
The candles in the east wing of Ashford Manor had been burning for 11 hours straight. 11 hours of fighting, not with swords, not with words, not with the sharp wit Lady Seraphina Voss had used every single day of her marriage to keep herself whole, but with her own body, on a narrow bed in a room that smelled of lavender water and fear, while the woman she had trusted most in the world held her hand and lied to her face. "He is coming," Mrs. Hadley said. "I sent the rider myself. The Duke will be here before morning." Seraphina said nothing. The pain took words right out of her mouth every few minutes, left her gasping, left her gripping the bedsheets until her knuckles went white and her fingers went numb. But between those waves, in the brief and terrible moments of stillness, she thought, she was very good at thinking. She had married the Duke of Ashford at 19. She was 23 now. 4 years was a long time to learn a person, long enough to understand the rhythm of their lies, the particular way their eyes moved when they were hiding something, the specific quality of silence that meant everything was wrong. The Duke had not come home in 6 weeks. He had sent 3 letters, short and careful, full of words that said nothing at all. Business in London. Matters of estate. She had read those letters sitting by the window in the blue parlor with afternoon light falling across the paper, and she had thought, with the calm that only comes from already knowing the worst, that her husband was not dealing with matters of estate. She was right, of course. She was always right, and it had never once helped her. Another wave of pain hit. She pressed her lips together and rode through it, and Mrs. Hadley murmured something soothing that Seraphina did not hear, and outside the window the December wind threw itself against the glass like it had its own urgent news to deliver. The baby was coming. The Duke's child, the heir to Ashford, the reason Seraphina had been examined and documented and treated like a very expensive piece of livestock for the better part of 2 years, was arriving tonight, on the coldest night of the year, in a room with no husband in it, with only a housekeeper and a midwife, and 2 frightened maids to bear witness. Seraphina had imagined this night differently. She had imagined it many times, the way women who have been lonely for a long time imagine things, carefully in detail, or with a kind of desperate hope that the imagining itself might make it real. She had imagined her husband's hand in hers. She had imagined him pacing outside the door, the way she had heard fathers did, worried, helpless, waiting. She had imagined that the birth of their child might be the thing that cracked open the cold and proper arrangement of their marriage and let something warmer through. She had been foolish. She knew that now. There was no imagining left in her. There was only surviving, one breath at a time, in a house that had gone very quiet in the way houses go quiet when they know their master is not coming back. Seraphina. That was not Mrs. Hadley's voice. She turned her head. The effort cost her something, but she turned because she recognized that voice, even through the fog of pain and exhaustion. Even after 2 years without seeing its owner, even after everything. Standing in the doorway, still wearing a traveling cloak, with December cold rolling off her like smoke, was her older sister, Margot Voss, who had married a country vicar at 17 and moved to Somerset and wrote letters every month for 4 years without fail, was standing in the doorway, and her face, her dear, familiar, freckled face, was doing something that faces should not do. It was doing too many things at once. Relief to see Seraphina alive, yes. but underneath it something tight and careful and terrified. The face of someone who has ridden a very long way to say something they have not yet found the words for. "Margot," Seraphina breathed, "what are you doing here? How did you know?" Margot crossed the room quickly and took Seraphina's free hand, the one Mrs. Hadley was not holding, and gripped it in both of her own. Her hands were cold from the journey. Her eyes were red. "I know," Margot said quietly. "I know everything. And I am so sorry, darling. I am so very sorry." Another wave of pain, enormous tidal. When it passed, Seraphina looked at her sister and said, with the calm of someone who has already swallowed the worst, "Tell me." Margot looked at Mrs. Hadley. Mrs. Hadley looked at the floor. In the silence between those two looks, Seraphina understood. Not the details. Not yet. But the shape of it, the size of it, the particular flavor of betrayal that had been sitting in the back of her throat for 6 weeks like something she could neither swallow nor spit out. "He is in London," Seraphina said. Not a question. "He is in London," Margot confirmed, "and he is not dealing with matters of estate." Margot's hands tightened. "No." "Then tell me," Seraphina said again. Her voice was the quietest it had ever been in her life, and that was exactly how she knew she was in real danger. Not the kind that comes from pain, but the kind that comes from heartbreak, which is so much harder to survive. Margot told her. Not everything. Not right then, not in the middle of labor, not while the midwife moved around on the other side of the room with careful hands and a careful face, but enough. Enough for Seraphina to understand that while she had been in this room for 11 hours, bringing his child into the world, the Duke of Ashford had been standing in a church in Mayfair, saying vows to someone else. So his name, in full, was Edmund Harlow, the 4th Duke of Ashford, and he was considered, by everyone who did not know him well enough to know better, to be one of the most admirable men in England. He was handsome the way men of his class were often handsome, which is to say cleanly, carefully, in a way that owed a great deal to good tailoring and very little to actual feeling. Tall, dark eyes that people frequently described as soulful, which was a strange word to use for eyes that had never once, in Seraphina's experience of them, reflected anything so vulnerable as a soul. He was intelligent. She would give him that. The sharpest man she had ever met, quick and precise, with a memory like a trap and a mind that could hold 15 conversations at once. Charming in public, quiet in private, and in 4 years of marriage he had been, by every measurable standard, perfectly correct. That was the word for him. Correct. He had never raised his voice at her. He had never been cruel. He had been dutiful and courteous and present in the minimal ways that a husband of his station was expected to be present. And if he had never been warm, if he had never been tender, if there had always been something in him that felt just slightly out of reach, well, that was not unusual. That was, in fact, perfectly correct. The problem was that Seraphina had loved him anyway. She had not meant to. She had entered the marriage with clear eyes and reasonable expectations, the way a sensible young woman from a respectable but not particularly wealthy family was supposed to approach a match with a duke. Falling in love was not part of the arrangement, but he had read to her once, so in the library during the first month of their marriage, when she could not sleep and had wandered downstairs at 2 a.m. and found him there with a candle and a book. He had looked up, and something had crossed his face that was not his usual careful expression, something unguarded, almost startled, as if he had not expected her to be real. And he had said without any particular grace, "The reading is better with company, if you would like to stay." She had stayed. He read to her for 3 hours, and she fell asleep in the chair across from him. And when she woke the next morning, she was in her own bed with a blanket over her. She never knew if he had carried her or called someone to do it. She never asked because she was afraid the answer would be the wrong one. That was the moment she had made her mistake. She loved him quietly, the way she did most things, with a steady patience she mistook for wisdom, and that was probably closer to stubbornness. She loved him through the cool politeness of their daily life, and the careful distance he kept, even in intimacy, and the way he sometimes looked at her across the dinner table with an expression she could not name, that she spent 4 years trying to name. She had loved him, and he had gone to London and married someone else. Lady Vivienne Fairfax was 19 years old and had the kind of beauty that made people stop mid-sentence. Seraphina would learn this later, in pieces, from Margot and from other people who delivered their information with the particular cruelty of those who believe they are being kind by saying everything at once. Vivienne's father was the Marquess of Dunmore, which meant she had beauty and money and title combined, which meant she had everything that a duke, in a complicated financial situation, might require in a second wife. Seraphina turned that phrase over in her mind during the hours that followed, during the final stretch of labor, during the extraordinary and terrible process of bringing a new life into the world, while her own world collapsed around her with the quiet efficiency of a well-planned demolition. She was not dead. Edmund knew she was alive. He had dined with her 6 weeks ago at this very table, in this very house, with perfect correctness. And 2 days later he had left for London, and she had stood on the front steps to wave him off, already heavy with their child. And he had looked at her from the carriage window with that unreadable expression she had spent 4 years trying to understand. Now she understood it. Guilt. It had always been guilt. She had been staring at guilt on his face for 4 years and had been too busy hoping it was something warmer to see it for what it was. The baby arrived at 4 in the morning. A boy, small and furious and perfect, with dark eyes that were going to be his father's eyes, and a voice like a declaration of war, and tiny fists already clenched against the cold air of the room. Seraphina held him and looked at his face and felt something so large and so complicated move through her that she could not have given it one name. Love, yes. A love so immediate and so total it was almost violent, like being struck by something solid, but also grief, also rage, also... Underneath everything, a cold and very clear decision forming in the back of her mind like ice crystals spreading across still water. She was not going to make a scene. Not the hot, messy kind, not the screaming and throwing things that Edmund probably expected from her, that he had probably counted on, which was why he had the geography of an entire city between them when she found out. Edmund Harlow, the 4th Duke of Ashford, was going to understand what he had done, in a quiet, precise, intelligent way, because he was the sharpest man she had ever met. But she had been married to him for 4 years, and she had been paying attention the entire time. She held her son. She looked at his face, and she began to plan. Edmund Harlow woke the morning after his wedding with the particular feeling of a man who has done something that cannot be undone. He lay in the half-dark of a rented house in Grosvenor Square. not the Ashford townhouse which he had surrendered for the week under the pretense of renovation, and stared at the ceiling without moving. Beside him, Vivian slept with the complete ease of someone who has never once been forced to make a choice that cost them anything real. Her hair spread across the pillow like a painting. She was very beautiful. He looked at her face and felt nothing he could properly name. His mother had told him this feeling would come. She had sat across from him 2 months ago in her London parlor. This small and ferociously organized woman who had managed the Ashford legacy through the deaths of 2 husbands and the near bankruptcy of one. And she had said with the brisk practicality she applied to everything, "You feel hollow now because you are still thinking about the wrong woman. That will pass." His mother had a talent for saying things that were both entirely true and entirely useless. He rose before Vivienne woke, dressed without ringing for his valet, and went downstairs to the small breakfast room, where a fire had already been lit by someone sensible and early rising. He poured himself coffee and stood by the window looking out at the grey London morning, and thought about Seraphina. He thought about Seraphina a great deal. That was the difficulty. That had always been the difficulty. He had married her for straightforward reasons. She was from a good family, well educated, quiet enough not to make trouble, pretty enough not to embarrass him. The Voss family name carried weight even without much money behind it, and Edmund, at 26, had needed a wife who would manage Ashford Manor without requiring too much of his attention, because his attention at 26 had been consumed entirely by the problem of saving an estate that his father had spent 20 years quietly destroying. He had not expected her to be interesting. That was his first mistake, and he had made it within a week of the wedding, when he found her in his library at 2 in the morning, reading a book of political philosophy that most men of his acquaintance would not have attempted. She had looked up at him without any particular embarrassment, the way people look when they are caught doing something completely normal, and said, "I hope you do not mind. I find I cannot sleep in strange houses until they feel less strange." He had said something about the reading being better with company, because it was true, and he had not yet learned to be careful around her. He should have been careful around her from the beginning. She was too perceptive. That was the real problem. She watched things with those quiet gray eyes, and she said very little, but she missed absolutely nothing. And every time he looked at her across a room, he had the unnerving sensation that she could see straight through the careful construction of his public self to whatever was underneath, and that whatever was underneath was not impressive enough to survive the examination. He had begun to love her somewhere in the 2nd year of their marriage. He had identified the feeling with horror, the way you identify a fire in a building you are standing inside of, and he had done what any sensible man in his situation would have done. He had created distance. He had been pleasant. He had been correct. He had been everything a husband was supposed to be and nothing more. And he had told himself that this was kindness, that loving her openly would only complicate things, that the estate needed saving, and he had obligations that preceded the inconvenient truth of his own heart. And then his mother had come to him with the Dunmore proposition, and the numbers were impossible to argue with, and the Ashford estate had debts that were becoming dangerous. Oh, and Vivienne Fairfax was beautiful and rich and completely uncomplicated, and Edmund had told himself, had genuinely, truly believed that a man in his position did not have the luxury of sentiment. He had told himself that Seraphina would be provided for, generously, that she and the child would want for nothing material, that the arrangement could be made quietly, respectably, in the way that arrangements of this kind were sometimes made among people of their class, that it need not destroy anyone. He had not let himself think about what it would actually feel like, standing in his kitchen in someone else's house the morning after his second wedding. Edmund Harlow thought about it now and found the feeling considerably worse than he had anticipated. A knock at the door. Not the front door, the kitchen entrance. The particular knock that meant a messenger, and a message that could not wait. The boy who brought it in was shaking from cold or haste or both. The letter he carried had been ridden through the night to reach London. Edmund recognized the Ashford seal on the outside of it, but the handwriting was Mrs. Hadley's, not Seraphina's, which told him everything before he opened it. He read it standing by the fire. His son had been born at 4 that morning. Both mother and child were well. Mrs. Hadley's letter was 3 sentences long and contained no warmth whatsoever, which was not like Mrs. Hadley at all. It was exactly like a woman who had served a household faithfully for 20 years and had just watched something unforgivable happen to the person she considered her responsibility to protect. Edmund set the letter down on the mantelpiece. He stood very still for a moment. Then he called for his horse. He arrived at Ashford Manor before noon. The ride from London should have taken longer, but he had pushed his horse and himself past the point of comfort, which was the only penance available to him on short notice, and which he knew perfectly well was not nearly enough. The manor looked different in the winter light, or perhaps he was looking at it differently. He had grown up in this house, had spent his entire life within its walls and on its grounds, and he had never once in his memory arrived home with the particular dread that sat in his chest now as he rode up the long approach and saw the windows of the east wing still lit, even in the middle of the day, as if someone wanted to make absolutely certain he would know exactly which room to feel terrible about. A groom took his horse. The front door opened before he reached it, which meant someone had been watching for him, which meant the entire household knew. Of course they knew. Households always knew. He had been naive to imagine otherwise. He walked through the house toward the east wing, and the corridors felt very long. Mrs. Hadley met him at the top of the stairs. She was a woman of 63 who had managed Ashford Manor through 2 generations of family drama with brisk competence and very little visible emotion. She stood in front of him now with her hands folded in front of her apron and her face arranged in the expression of someone who has decided that honesty is the only courtesy left available. "She is awake," Mrs. Hadley said. "She was awake most of the night. The child is well. She has named him Thomas." Thomas, or his father's name. Edmund absorbed this. "Is she—" he began. "She is composed," Mrs. Hadley said. "Perfectly composed. I would not mistake that for an absence of feeling, Your Grace." She stood aside to let him pass, but her eyes, as he walked by her, said the thing her professional discipline would not allow her mouth to say. He pushed open the bedroom door. Seraphina was sitting up in bed with Thomas in her arms, and she looked at him when he entered the room, and she did not look the way he had expected her to look. He had expected tears. He had braced for fury. He had prepared, during the long ride from London, a version of himself that could absorb grief and rage and recrimination without flinching, because that was what he deserved, and he knew it, and he was ready to stand in it. What he was not prepared for was this. She looked at him with clear, steady eyes, and a face that was entirely calm, and she said, "Close the door, Edmund." He closed the door. He crossed the room and stood at the foot of the bed, and he opened his mouth to say something. The beginning of the speech he had been constructing for the entire ride, the version of events that acknowledged wrongdoing while still somehow trying to explain it. And she stopped him. "Do not," she said quietly. "Whatever you have prepared to say to me, I would prefer you did not." He stopped. She looked down at Thomas in her arms, then back up at Edmund, and her expression was the most frightening thing he had ever seen on a human face, because it was so completely without hope. Not angry, not devastated, simply finished. See the way a fire looks when it has burned through everything available and has nothing left to consume. "I want you to look at your son," she said. Edmund looked at Thomas. The baby was asleep, small and dark-haired, with a face that was doing the particular flattened, squashed, brand-new thing that newborn faces do. "He was born at 4 this morning," Seraphina said. "I labored for 11 hours. Your housekeeper held my hand. Your midwife delivered him safely. Your house was full of women doing the work of the night while you were in a church in Mayfair." She paused. "I want you to know that I know every detail of it. Not just that you were married last night, but the church, and the dress she wore, and the names of the witnesses, and the breakfast that was served afterward. I want you to know that I know all of it, because I want you to understand that I am not confused about what happened." Edmund said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I am not going to make this ugly," Seraphina continued in that same quiet and terrifying voice. "I have a son to raise, and I will not spend the years of his childhood in the middle of a war. But I want you to be very clear about one thing." She met his eyes, and for just a moment something moved behind her composed expression, something that had been alive and was still alive, even though it should not have been after a night like this one. "You have made a choice. That choice has consequences, and I am going to be very patient while those consequences find you." Edmund stood at the foot of the bed in the room where his son had been born 12 hours ago and felt, for the first time in his adult life, something that he could not organize into anything manageable. She was not angry. That was what undid him. He had been so certain of her anger. He had relied on it somewhere in the back of his planning as a thing he could meet and respond to and eventually navigate past. Her anger would have been survivable. He knew how to manage anger. Her certainty was something else entirely. She was not a woman in the middle of grief. She was a woman who had already passed through grief and come out the other side into something colder and much more deliberate, and the look she gave him as he stood there with his well-prepared words going to dust in his mouth was the look of someone who has understood exactly what they are dealing with and has already begun to deal with it. "You may see him whenever you wish," she said, looking back down at Thomas. "He is your son. I will not use him as a weapon. I am not that kind of person." There was a pause. "I hope," she added softly, "that you will eventually remember that." The news reached London society in the way that truly extraordinary news always reached London society, which is to say immediately and from 17 different directions at once. The Duke of Ashford had been married in Mayfair on a Tuesday evening in December. His first wife, the Duchess of Ashford, had delivered his heir in the family estate in Wiltshire on that same Tuesday evening. Both events had witnesses. Both witnesses had servants. And servants, as a rule, talked to other servants, who talked to ladies' maids, who told their mistresses, who wrote letters, who had tea. By Thursday morning, it was in every parlor in London. By Friday, it was embellished. By Saturday, the version circulating through the better drawing rooms had taken on the particular quality of a story that has been told so many times by so many different mouths that it has acquired its own weight, its own drama, its own irresistible shape. People were saying the Duchess had known nothing. People were saying she had known everything and had been too proud to fight. People were saying the Duke was a monster. People were saying he was simply a man in an impossible situation, which was the version of the story that men preferred and women mostly rejected. Lady Harrington, who knew everyone and had opinions about all of them, said at her Friday evening card party that the whole thing was perfectly dreadful and that someone ought to do something. By which she meant that she hoped someone would do something interesting that she could discuss the following Friday. Lord Pemberton, who had been at school with Edmund and still considered himself a friend, sent a carefully worded note to the Grosvenor Square house suggesting that Edmund might consider making a statement of some kind before the statement was made for him. Edmund did not respond to this note. He was not in London. He had spent Thursday and Friday at Ashford Manor, sleeping in the guest wing of his own house, which was the least of what he deserved, and spending the daylight hours in a state of suspended animation, walking the grounds in the cold and sitting in the library that smelled of the same books he had read to Seraphina 3 years ago and trying to understand how he had arrived at this precise configuration of disaster. Seraphina was everywhere in this house. That was the thing he had not anticipated. He had lived here for most of his adult life, and it had always been, above all things, his house. His father's house, his grandfather's house, the physical embodiment of everything the Ashford title meant. But somewhere in 4 years of marriage it had become her house too, not by any formal arrangement, but simply by her presence in it. By the way, she had quietly and without fuss made it into a place where flowers appeared in rooms that had never had flowers, and books were left half-read on side tables, and the cook knew to have the kitchen warm by 6, because the Duchess often came down early. He kept expecting to walk around a corner and find her reading something impractical in the morning light. He found her on Saturday, not by accident, but because they were both adults living in the same structure, and the structure had finite rooms and finite corridors, and he had walked into the blue parlor to look for a letter he needed, and she was sitting by the window in the chair she always sat in, feeding Thomas with the particular absorbed focus of a new mother, with the winter afternoon light falling across her the way light in this room always had. And he stopped in the doorway because he could not make himself go forward and could not make himself leave. She did not look up. "The letter you are looking for is on the desk," she said. "3rd drawer." He stood there for a moment. "How did you know I was looking for a letter?" "Because it is the only thing in this room that is yours." She still did not look up. "Everything else I have rearranged." He went to the desk. He opened the 3rd drawer and found the letter and stood holding it without reading it, because reading it would give him a reason to leave, and he found, with some shame, that he did not want to leave. "Seraphina," he said. "I need you to know. I know everything I need to know," she said pleasantly, still looking at Thomas, still with that terrible composed warmth that was entirely for her son and had nothing left over for anyone else in the room. "Thank you, Edmund." He left. He went back to London on Sunday. Vivian was waiting in the Ashford townhouse, which had been opened and prepared with fresh flowers and new curtains, by a household staff who were, to their considerable credit, professionally pleasant about the entire situation. She was very glad to see him. She was 19, and this was all an adventure to her, a romantic and slightly dramatic adventure, which was in some ways the most exhausting thing about her. "There is a letter from Mamma," she said, handing it to him at the door. "And Lord Pemberton called, and Lady Harrington has invited us to dinner on Wednesday, which I thought was very brave of her." Edmund took the letters without reading them. He looked at Vivienne's bright, uncomplicated face and felt the particular loneliness of a man who has everything he planned for and nothing he actually wanted. "I need to speak to my solicitor," he said. "Of course," said Vivienne, who did not know yet that some of what the solicitor was going to be asked to arrange was the protection of a woman in Wiltshire, or that the size of the arrangements would make it clear to anyone paying attention that Edmund Harlow was not nearly as detached from his first marriage as he wanted people to believe. Meanwhile, in Wiltshire, Seraphina was having a visitor. She had not expected the carriage. She had been informed by Mrs. Hadley that a vehicle was approaching up the long drive, and she had stood at the window and watched it come and tried to identify the crest on the side, and when she identified it she sat down quite suddenly in the nearest chair because her legs stopped working properly. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford, Edmund's mother. She had met the woman twice. Both encounters had been brief, formal, and faintly icy. The Dowager Duchess was not a warm woman. She had the same precise intelligence as her son, and considerably fewer reasons to moderate it with anything so inconvenient as feeling. Seraphina composed herself before the Dowager entered the room, which meant she stood up and straightened her dress and arranged her face and breathed, and when the door opened she was standing in the middle of the blue parlor with Thomas in her arms and her chin level. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford was 70 years old and walked with a cane and moved through every room she entered like a small and very expensive weather system. She looked at Seraphina. She looked at Thomas. She looked at Seraphina again. Then she did something Seraphina had never seen her do. She sat down without being invited, and the cane tapped the floor twice, and she said, "Let me see the child." Seraphina brought Thomas to her. The Dowager examined him with the careful attention of someone assessing value, which might have been offensive from anyone else, but from this woman was simply how she showed that something mattered. "He has the Harlow eyes," she said. "I know," Seraphina said. "Sit down." Seraphina sat. The Dowager handed Thomas back with both hands, which was the most careful thing Seraphina had ever seen her do. Then she folded those hands in her lap and looked at Seraphina with her sharp old eyes, and said without preamble, "My son has done a very foolish thing." "Yes," Seraphina agreed. "I will not insult you by defending it. I appreciate that. What I will tell you," the Dowager said, "is that the Constance Fairfax situation," she seemed to consider the name with some distaste, "was my doing. More than his. The estate was in danger. The Dunmore money was the solution available to us. Edmund was not as willing as I required him to be, and I applied pressure that I should perhaps not have applied." Seraphina looked at her. "Are you apologizing to me?" The Dowager's expression flickered. "I am providing context." "I see. The context," the Dowager continued, "does not excuse what happened, but it does clarify who is primarily responsible. See, and I thought you deserved to know that it was not entirely my son's idea." There was a silence. "His marriage last Tuesday," the Dowager said carefully. "I need you to understand that in the eyes of the Church and the law, It is not valid. Seraphina became very still. You are his wife, the dowager said. You have been his wife for 4 years. You have now given him his heir. There was no dissolution of your marriage. No annulment was sought. No legal process was completed. What happened in that church in Mayfair was not a marriage. It was a ceremony attended by people who did not know enough to stop it. She paused. Or who knew and chose not to. The room was very quiet. He did not tell Vivienne Fairfax, Seraphina said slowly. No. He did not tell her father. The Marquis was given to understand that the situation with you was resolved. He was not told how. Seraphina held Thomas a little tighter. And the child, what does Vivienne believe about me? That you exist, the dowager said. That you are unfortunately still living. That a quiet arrangement would be reached that would allow everyone to proceed with dignity. The words sat in the room. I see, Seraphina said for the second time. Her voice was perfectly level. He was going to quietly arrange me into a corner somewhere and pretend I was a problem that had been resolved. I believe that was the general plan, yes? And you are here to tell me this because? The Dowager Duchess looked at her grandson, asleep and warm in his mother's arms, with those ancient sharp eyes. She was quiet for a moment that was longer than her usual silences. Then she said something that Seraphina would turn over in her mind for weeks afterward, examining it from every angle. Because I have spent 70 years in this family, arranging people into corners, the old woman said, and I am very tired of it, and I would like to do at least one thing differently before I die. The thing about London society in the winter of 1843 was that it was very good at being shocked and very bad at being surprised. It had heard extraordinary things before. It had processed scandals of every variety, financial ruin and romantic disaster and political disgrace, and the occasional criminal matter that everyone discussed in hushed voices for 3 months and then never mentioned again. It was, as a whole, experienced, resilient, almost professionally hard to astonish. But the business of the Duke of Ashford managed it. The story had everything: a wronged wife, a bigamous marriage, a newborn heir, a young woman who believed herself a duchess and was apparently not, a mother-in-law who had traveled to Wiltshire for reasons that were being speculated about wildly and incorrectly in every drawing room in the city, and at the center of it, Edmund Harlow himself, who had returned to London on Sunday and had since made no public appearances and sent no communications and had, by all available evidence, gone to ground somewhere in the Ashford townhouse and was simply waiting for something to happen. Something was about to happen. Seraphina arrived in London on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after Thomas was born. She arrived in her own carriage with Mrs. Hadley beside her and Thomas in her arms, and Margot, who had stayed on at Ashford Manor since the night of the birth, and whose presence was a comfort and also a warning to anyone paying attention that Seraphina had support. She had not announced her arrival. She did not need to. Arrivals of this kind announced themselves. She had been to London twice in 4 years of marriage. Both times Edmund had brought her, and both times she had moved through the city on his arm and in his shadow, which was where wives of her station were expected to move. She knew how to inhabit that role. She had done it with reasonable grace. This time she was not in anyone's shadow. She went first to see the solicitor. Not Edmund's solicitor, Her own, a man named Mr. Alderton, who had been her father's solicitor before his death, and who had written to her 3 months into her marriage, suggesting, with careful professional tact, that she might wish to have independent legal counsel, and who had been waiting ever since, with the patience of a man who already knew how the story ended. She sat in his office with Thomas in her arms and Margot beside her, and she told Mr. Alderton everything she knew, which was considerable, because the Dowager Duchess had been thorough. Mr. Alderton listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The marriage in Mayfair is, as you understand, legally invalid. The question is how you wish to proceed." "I wish to proceed," Seraphina said, "in a way that protects my son's inheritance, establishes clearly that I am and have always been the Duchess of Ashford, and ensures that Vivienne Fairfax understands that she has been deceived by people who owed her the truth." Mr. Alderton looked at her with an expression that combined professional admiration with some personal relief. "And the Duke himself?" Seraphina looked at Thomas. He was awake, making the small, unfocused expressions of a baby, discovering the world one sensation at a time. She watched him for a moment. "I have not yet decided what I want from the Duke himself," she said honestly. "But I know what I do not want. I do not want a war. I do not want Thomas to grow up in the middle of a battlefield. And I do not want to spend the rest of my life defined by what Edmund did to me. What do you want to be defined by?" She looked up. It was an unusual question for a solicitor to ask. She suspected Mr. Alderton was a more unusual solicitor than his modest office suggested. "Myself," she said simply. Mr. Alderton nodded and began to write. Edmund knew she was in London before noon. His valet told him because the valet had it from the footman, who had it from the boy who had been sent to Ashford Manor 3 days ago with a letter from Edmund that had been returned unopened, and who had come back instead with the information that the Duchess had already left for the city. The network of information in a great house was as efficient as any telegraph, and considerably more candid. He sent a note to her hotel. She was not staying at the Ashford townhouse, which was both understandable and, if he was being precise about it, like a small clean cut in a place he had not known could still feel things. The note said, "I would very much like to speak with you if you are willing." The response came back within the hour in her handwriting. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, the hotel sitting room. Please be punctual." He arrived at 9:55. She was already there, which meant she had been there before him, which meant she was not going to give him the advantage of being the one who was seated and composed when the other person entered. He noted this with the part of his mind that was always, even now, cataloguing the things about her that impressed him, and he took the chair across from her and did not attempt to pretend that this was a normal situation. She looked well. That was the first thing he noticed, and it bothered him that it was the first thing he noticed, because she should not have looked well. She was 11 days out from a labor that had lasted through an entire night. She had received the worst possible news in the worst possible circumstances, and she had traveled to London with an infant in the middle of winter. She should have looked fragile, wounded, the way people look when they have been genuinely and thoroughly damaged. She looked clear-eyed and rested and formidably organized, and there was something about her that had changed in the 11 days since he had stood at the foot of her bed in Ashford Manor. Something that had been present in her for 4 years, but quietly in the background, that was now entirely in the foreground. She looked, he thought, like herself, fully and without apology, perhaps for the first time. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course." He paused. "Where is Thomas?" "With Mrs. Hadley and my sister. He is well." She folded her hands in her lap in the way she had that always looked like patience, and he now understood was actually precision. "I asked you here because I think we should speak plainly. I have never been good at pretending things are different from what they are, and I do not intend to start." "That is fair," he said. "Your marriage in Mayfair is not valid," she said. "You know this. Your solicitor knows this. The Church of England, when petitioned, will know this. Vivienne Fairfax's father, when informed, will know this. I am telling you this not as a threat, but as a fact, because I think we should be conducting this conversation in the same reality." He nodded. "Thomas is your heir. His position is secure, and I will pursue every available means to ensure it remains so. That is not negotiable, and is not part of any discussion we might have about anything else." "Agreed," he said quietly. "I want you to tell Vivienne the truth," Seraphina said. "Not through a solicitor, not through her father. Yourself, directly. Because she deserves to hear it from the person who deceived her, and she deserves to be given the chance to respond without having it filtered through other people first." Edmund looked at his hands. "Yes. She is 19 years old, Edmund. She has done nothing wrong. She went into a marriage in good faith and has been made into a scandal through no fault of her own, and she is going to spend the rest of her life attached to this story, whether she wishes to be or not. The least she deserves is the honest account of what happened, from you." "I know," he said. And then, because there was nothing else available that was worth saying, "I am sorry, Seraphina." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know you are," she said. "I think you have been sorry for longer than you realize. That does not change what happened." "No," he agreed. "It does not. But it is," she said carefully, "worth something." Vivienne Fairfax had grown up being told she was the most beautiful girl in any room she entered. People had been telling her this since she was 4 years old, and by 19 she had learned to accept it, the way one accepts a weather report, as useful information about one's circumstances, but not particularly about oneself. She was not vain. She was simply a person who understood very clearly that her beauty was the first thing anyone noticed about her, and had accordingly developed a very strong preference for being noticed for other things, which was made difficult by the fact that there were very few rooms in her world where other things were invited. She had liked Edmund when she met him. She had found him handsome and intelligent and rather difficult to read, which she had taken as a sign of depth. She had been presented to him at a dinner party in November, and he had spoken to her for 20 minutes about history of all things, the actual ancient history of the Romans, which was not what any man had ever done at a dinner party in her experience, and she had found it completely refreshing. Her father had told her 3 weeks later that a match was being arranged. She had not been precisely consulted, but she had not objected. She liked Edmund. The estate was impressive. The title was impressive. She had assumed, in the way of girls who have always had the things they were supposed to have, that liking him was sufficient. Now she was sitting in a parlor in Mayfair, while her husband, or the man who had called himself her husband for 11 days, sat across from her and told her the truth. He was thorough. She would give him that. He did not minimize or excuse. He told her the timeline, the decisions, the motivations, the involvement of his mother, the existence of Thomas. He told her that Seraphina was alive and well and in London and had been his legal wife for 4 years. He told her that their ceremony in December was not a marriage. Vivienne listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment that stretched in the room like something physical. Then she said, "Did you love her?" Edmund stopped. It was not the question he had prepared for. He had prepared for rage, for her father's lawyers, for tears or accusations or the particular injured fury of a girl who has every right to be furious. He had not prepared for this. "Did you love her?" Vivienne said again. Not as a question this time, but as a statement of something she was working out. "Because everything you have just told me, the way you told it, sounds like someone explaining why they did something they knew was wrong and could not quite make themselves stop." Edmund was quiet for a long time. "Yes," he said finally. "I think I have for some time." Vivienne nodded very slowly, the way people nod when they are confirming something they already suspected. "Then why did you do this?" she asked. Not angrily, with genuine curiosity, the kind that belongs to intelligent people who really want to understand things. "Because I was a coward," Edmund said, "and because my mother was very persuasive. And because I convinced myself that what I felt for her was manageable, and that what the estate needed was real, and that a man of sense would choose what was real." "That is," Vivienne said after a moment, "an extraordinarily stupid way to think." "Yes," he agreed. "I know." She stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the Mayfair street below. She stood there for a long time. When she turned back, her face had the particular expression of someone who has made a decision and is surprised to find it was not as difficult as they expected. "I am angry with you," she said clearly. "I want you to know that I am very angry, not in a way I intend to perform for anyone's benefit, just genuinely, privately angry. That is deserved. My father is going to be considerably more than angry. I know. And I am going to need—" She paused, organizing herself. "I am going to need time to understand what my situation is, what I am now, what I am to the world after this." She met his eyes. "But I am not going to pretend that the most useful thing I can do is punish everyone indefinitely. My mother always said that a woman who makes her misery into her identity is a woman who has given up on having anything else." Edmund looked at her and felt, perhaps for the first time, something genuinely like respect. "Your mother," he said, "sounds like a very wise woman." "She is," Vivienne said, "unlike apparently your mother." The Marquis of Dunmore was less composed. He arrived at the Ashford townhouse at 8 in the morning, 2 days later with his solicitor and his second son, and an expression that could have melted glass. And the meeting that followed was long and loud, and conducted at a volume that the household staff heard very clearly through 2 closed doors and a corridor. Edmund did not attempt to defend the indefensible. He sat across from the Marquis and his team and agreed to every financial provision they outlined, which were significant, and he accepted every statement the Marquis wished to make about his character, which were numerous and largely accurate, and he said very little because there was very little to say. The Marquis left after 3 hours. He did not shake Edmund's hand. When the door closed behind him, the house was very quiet. Edmund sat for a long time in the empty room. Then he wrote a letter. Not to his solicitor, and not to his mother, and not to anyone connected to the catastrophe of the past month. He wrote a letter to Seraphina at her hotel, and he wrote it in his own handwriting without drafting it first, which meant it was not as controlled as he would have liked it to be, and probably said more than he would have allowed himself to say if he had thought about it carefully. He sent it. He did not know what he expected in return. Seraphina read the letter twice. She sat in the window seat of her hotel room, with Thomas asleep in the small travel cot beside her, and Margot somewhere in the next room, being deliberately quiet. And she read the letter once quickly and then again slowly, and she sat for a while afterward just looking at it. It was not an eloquent letter. Edmund was a precise man and a careful writer. But this letter was neither of those things. It was the letter of someone who had put down all their precision and carefulness, and had written simply what was true. And what was true was that he was sorry in a way that went much deeper than the apology he had offered in the hotel's sitting room, and that he had loved her for longer than he had admitted to anyone, including himself, and that he had done the worst possible thing with that love by pretending it did not exist, and that he understood if none of this changed anything, and that he was not writing to ask for anything because he had forfeited the right to ask her for anything, but that he thought she should know. Seraphina folded the letter and held it in her hands. She was not going to decide anything today. She was 11 days out from the worst night of her life, and she was in a strange room in a city that was not her home, and her son was asleep 2 feet away from her, and there was too much still in motion to decide anything today. But she thought about what the dowager had said, about spending 70 years arranging people into corners, about wanting to do at least one thing differently before the end. And she thought about the man who had read to her in the library at 2 a.m, with his careful face gone unguarded, who had put a blanket over her when she fell asleep and never mentioned it, who had spent 4 years looking at her with an expression she had been too hopeful and too afraid to name. She was not ready to forgive him, but she was not going to decide today that forgiveness was impossible. That was enough for now. That, she thought, was a reasonable amount of grace to offer to a person who had treated her very poorly and who was, underneath all of it, still the man from the library. Still the man from 2 a.m, still the man whose face had gone unguarded just once in 4 years, and who had never been brave enough to let it happen again. She set the letter on the table beside her. She looked at Thomas. "We are going to be all right," she told him, in the calm voice she had been practicing since the night she understood everything. "We are going to be perfectly all right." Thomas opened his dark eyes and looked at her with the ancient and trusting gaze of the very new, and she felt again that enormous love, that violent and total love, and it held everything else in proportion the way it always did. Spring came to Ashford Manor the way it always did, which is to say gradually and then all at once, the grounds going from grey to green in a matter of days in early April, the gardens that Seraphina had been reshaping since her first year of marriage finally coming into the fullness of what she had imagined for them. She was in the garden on a morning in the second week of April when Mrs. Hadley came to tell her that the Duke had arrived. "He wrote last week," Seraphina said, not looking up from what she was doing, which was directing 2 gardeners in the planting of a rosebed along the south wall. "I told him he might come." "Yes, Your Grace." Mrs. Hadley paused. "Shall I have him wait in the library?" Seraphina considered. "Yes. And tea, please." She finished directing the gardeners and then took her time walking back to the house. Not out of deliberate unkindness, but because she had learned in the past 4 months that there was real value in taking her time, that the old reflexive hurrying toward whatever Edmund needed had served neither of them particularly well, and that a woman who moved at her own pace through her own garden on a spring morning was a woman who was going to walk into that library from a position of genuine steadiness rather than performed calm. She had spent 4 months in genuine steadiness. It had cost a great deal to build, and she was not going to waste it by rushing. Edmund was standing by the window when she came in, not sitting in one of the chairs, but standing with his hands behind his back, in the posture of a man who has been somewhere long enough to decide that sitting would be presumptuous. He turned when she entered, and she looked at him properly for the first time since the hotel sitting room in January. He looked tired, not in a broken way, not in a way that asked for sympathy, in the way of a man who has spent several months doing difficult things that needed doing. There had been the matter of the Dunmore settlement, which had been finalized in February. There had been the visit to the Archbishop's office that had formalized what everyone already understood about the December ceremony. There had been his mother, who had, according to reports from various directions, been held by Edmund to a standard of accountability that she had apparently found deeply unfamiliar. And there had been, Seraphina had heard from sources she trusted, so a series of quiet visits by Edmund to families and persons who had been affected by the business and who deserved to be spoken to directly rather than through intermediaries. He had, in short, been doing the work. She noticed this. She had been noticing it for 4 months, carefully and without letting it move her faster than was wise. "Hello, Edmund," she said. "Seraphina." He looked at her with the same unreadable expression she had spent 4 years trying to decode, and then, as if he had finally decided that keeping it unreadable was a waste of both their time, he let it be readable. He was frightened. He was hopeful. He was looking at her the way people look when something matters so much that their usual systems for not showing things break down completely. "Thank you for allowing me to come." "Sit down," she said. "Ah, the tea is coming." They sat. The tea came. Mrs. Hadley left with the particular discreet efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation for months and was going to give it every chance to go well. "Thomas is well?" Edmund asked. "He is brilliant," Seraphina said simply, and the warmth that came into her face was not for Edmund, but it was visible to him, and she did not hide it. "He has discovered his hands this week and considers them endlessly fascinating." Edmund smiled. It was a real smile, the kind she had seen perhaps 6 times in 4 years, the kind that made him look like a different person, like the person underneath the correct and careful person. "May I see him? Before I leave, if it suits." "Yes, he will be awake after noon." She poured the tea. She handed him his cup. Their hands did not touch. She sat back in her chair and looked at him steadily and waited for him to say what he had come to say. "I have been thinking," Edmund said, "about what I want to ask you. All right? And I keep arriving at the same difficulty, which is that I am not certain I have the right to ask you anything at all." "You have the right to ask," she said. "You simply cannot be certain of the answer." "Then I will ask." He set his cup down and looked at her with that open, readable face. "I would like the chance to do this differently. I understand if that is not something you are willing to consider. I understand if 4 years of what I gave you and then what I did to you last December has closed every door. But I spent this winter thinking about what I actually want, You without the estate and the title and my mother and every other thing that has been standing between me and being honest. And what I want is a marriage that actually exists. Not the correct version. The real one. Seraphina was quiet. Outside, the spring garden was bright and new, and the roses along the south wall were beginning to show the first small buds of what would eventually be a very fine display. "I did not stop loving you," she said at last. "I want to be clear about that. What happened in December did not stop it. The love was still there. It simply had nowhere to go, and a woman with nowhere to put love and no one to trust with it will eventually put it somewhere else. I put it into this house, and into Thomas, and into myself, and I found that I was in fact quite capable of being sufficient to my own life without depending on your warmth for my sense of safety." Edmund listened. "I am telling you this," she continued, "because I want you to understand that I am not going to come back to an arrangement that requires me to wait quietly for the moments when you decide to let your guard down. I am not going to be the woman who lives in the hope of being seen." She met his eyes. "If we do this, and I have not decided that we do this, it is because you have decided to actually show up. Not correctly. Actually, yes," he said. "I will not forgive you in one conversation. I know. And there will be days when I am angry, and I will not apologize for those days. Please do not. And Thomas comes first in everything, always." "He should," Edmund said. "He absolutely should. He always will." Seraphina looked at him for a long and quiet moment. Then she said, "Tell me something true. Not about any of this. Just something true about yourself that you have not told anyone." He blinked. It was the last thing he had expected her to say, and she knew it, which was part of why she said it. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him actually think, watched him not reach for the first available answer, but search for something real. "I have been afraid," he said slowly, "for most of my life that if I let anyone see what I actually am, not the Duke, not the estate, not the title, that what they found would not be enough, that there would not be enough there to justify the love." He paused. "And I think I chose distance over risk every time it mattered, because I could not bear the possibility of being seen and found insufficient." He looked at his hands. "And I think that is a very poor reason," he said quietly, "to make the people you love feel invisible." Seraphina held that answer for a moment, turned it over. It was, she thought, the truest thing he had ever said to her. It was possibly the truest thing she had ever heard him say to anyone. "You are not insufficient," she said. "You are frightened and you made terrible choices, and those are not the same thing." She picked up her tea. "I am not telling you that changes everything, but I am telling you that it changes something." He looked up. The morning light was coming through the library windows the way it always had in this room. The same light that had been falling across this furniture and these books and these two people in various configurations for 4 years. And it was spring, and the garden outside was becoming what she had always planned it would be, and Thomas would be awake after noon, and there was a very long way still to go. But there was, Seraphina thought, a way to go. That was the thing she had not been certain of in December, in that room, in that pain, holding her newborn son with the news of betrayal still fresh in her chest. She had made her decision and begun to plan, and she had been so focused on the planning that she had not let herself think about what came after the battle, whether there was something worth building once the smoke cleared. There was something worth building. She could see it. She sitting across from him in the library with their tea going cool between them and the spring morning loud and green outside the window. Not what they had before. Not that careful, correct, closed-off version of a marriage that had been more like a performance of the idea of marriage than the actual thing. Something new. Something that knew what it cost. Something built on ground that had been cleared by fire and was, for that reason, very solid. She was not going to say this to him today. He had not earned today. He had earned the conversation. He had earned her being in the room and being honest and not having already decided against him. That was what 4 months of doing the work got a person. More would take more. Come back next Sunday, she said. If you wish. He looked at her with that open, readable face. I wish, he said. Then come back. You may stay to dinner. Thank you. And bring a book, she said. Something worth reading. The evenings here are quiet, and I find the reading is better with company. He recognized the words. She saw him recognize them. Watch something move through his face that was not performed, and not managed, and not correct. That was simply real. The pure and uncomplicated feeling of someone who has been given something they did not know they still had the right to want. I know just the one, he said quietly. Outside, a bird began to sing in the new garden. The roses along the south wall caught the morning light. Thomas, somewhere in the house above them, was being looked after by good and faithful people who wanted everyone in this story to find their way through, because good and faithful people tend to want that, tend to hold the light steady in the window while the people they love are finding their way home. Seraphina set down her cup. She looked at her husband, her real husband, her legal husband, the man from the library and the blanket, and the unreadable expression that had turned out to be guilt and love in equal measure, and she felt the enormous, complicated thing she had been carrying since December shift slightly, not put down, not gone, but differently held in a way that left her hands a little freer. All right then, she said. 2 words, small enough to take back and large enough to change everything, which was, she thought, exactly the right size for a beginning. The kingdom did not forget what had happened. Kingdoms rarely do. The story of the Duke of Ashford and his 2 weddings circulated through London for years afterward, gathered legends and embellishments and moral interpretations that said more about the tellers than about the people involved. There were those who never forgave Edmund, and those who considered Seraphina a fool for not leaving, and those who took the whole thing as proof that the institution of marriage was beyond saving, and those who said it proved exactly the opposite. Vivian Fairfax married, 3 years later, a perfectly decent man who had been a soldier and who admired her intelligence considerably more than her beauty and told her so regularly, which she found so refreshing that she fell entirely in love with him inside of 6 months. She and Seraphina exchanged letters occasionally, civil and then warm and eventually genuinely friendly, which was an outcome that surprised everyone and should not have, because both women were considerably more capable than the world had given them room to demonstrate. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford lived to 81, which she seemed to consider a personal accomplishment. In her final years, she was, by all accounts, considerably softer than she had been in her powerful ones, though she maintained until the end that she had done what the situation required, and that anyone who had her responsibilities would have done the same. Thomas adored her, which she found gratifying, and Edmund found baffling. But then Thomas was a person of remarkable generosity of spirit who found something to love in nearly everyone, which his mother took as a great personal triumph, and his father took as evidence that some things skip a generation and come out better for it. Edmund came back the following Sunday with a book under his arm. He stayed to dinner. He came back the Sunday after that, and the one after that, and eventually he stopped coming back and simply stayed. Not all at once, but gradually, the way things that are true tend to assert themselves, quietly, persistently, until one day they are simply the fact of the matter and always were. The library at Ashford Manor, in the years that followed, was often occupied late into the evening. The candles in that room burned long. The books on those shelves were read and reread and discussed with the kind of honest, careful attention that requires two people who have decided to actually see each other. It was not a perfect story. No real story is. But it was theirs, properly, at last, built not on the arrangement that had been made for them or the disaster that had nearly destroyed them, but on the ground they chose together with clear eyes after everything. And that, as anyone who has ever loved someone through the worst of themselves will tell you, is the only kind of love that actually lasts.